Chapter 11, Contracts, Risk, and Protection. In this chapter, we're going to talk about something that many property owners rush through, construction contracts. And I understand why. By the time owners reach this stage, they are usually emotionally ready to move forward. They have been planning, meeting contractors, reviewing bids, talking through ideas, and finally, it feels like the project is about to begin. So when the contract shows up, many owners mainly focus on two things, the price and the timeline. But the contract is much bigger than that, because the contract is not just paperwork. The contract is the structure that defines how problems, decisions, money, changes, risk, and expectations will be handled once pressure enters the project. And pressure always enters the project eventually. That is why understanding the contract matters so much before signing. Most owners do not fully read the contract. This happens constantly. Owners skim the contract looking mainly for price, deposit amount, timeline, and maybe a few major details, but they do not slow down enough to fully understand how the project relationship is actually structured. That becomes dangerous later, because once construction begins, the contract becomes the reference point for disagreements, expectations, payments, and responsibilities. So if something was misunderstood early, that misunderstanding usually becomes stressful later. This is why I always encourage owners, do not rush contract review emotionally just because you are excited to get started. Slow down, read carefully. Do not rush contract review emotionally just because you are excited to start. Slow down, read carefully, ask questions, and make sure you understand what you are agreeing to before signing. The contract defines more than price. A lot of owners think the contract mainly exists to lock in the project cost, but contracts actually define much more than that. They define things like the scope, payment structure, allowances, exclusions, timeline expectations, change order process, responsibilities, permits, insurance requirements, termination rights, dispute resolution, warranty language, and how unforeseen conditions are handled. That is a lot. Many owners do not realize how important these sections become until problems appear later, which is why understanding the contract early is very important. Scope gaps become contract gaps. This connects directly to what we discussed in the last episode. If the scope is unclear before the contract is signed, the contract usually becomes unclear too. And unclear contracts create instability because now everyone may be operating from different expectations. The owner believes certain things are included, the contractor assumes they are excluded. The plans may not fully clarify it, and now confusion turns into conflict once construction starts moving forward. This is why scope clarity before contracting is a necessity. The stronger the scope definition becomes, the stronger the contract becomes as well. Understand how change orders work. The change order process and almost every significant project experiences changes at some point. Sometimes because the owner changes their mind, sometimes because hidden conditions appear, sometimes because the city requires corrections, or because material availability changes. The issue is not whether changes happen, the issue is how those changes are handled. Good contracts define how changes are documented, how pricing is approved, how schedule impacts are communicated, and whether work can proceed before owner approval. That matters enormously because unclear change order systems create budget drift and emotional stress. Payment structure matters. This is another area you need to pay close attention to, how payments are structured, because payment structure affects risk. Now, every project is different. But generally speaking, owners should understand what the deposit covers, what progress payments are tied to, whether payments are connected to actual milestones, how material deposits are handled, what documentation accompanies invoices, and what conditions trigger final payment. Because once money moves out, leverage changes, and owners need clarity around that process before construction begins. The contract should address uncertainty honestly. Strong contracts do not pretend uncertainty does not exist. They acknowledge it. especially on remodels and older properties. For example, what happens if hidden damage is discovered? What happens if utilities need upgrading? What happens if permit corrections require changes? What happens if existing conditions differ from assumptions? What happens if materials become unavailable? Construction involves uncertainty, and contracts become healthier when uncertainty is addressed transparently instead of ignored emotionally. Because pretending risk does not exist does not remove the risk. It only delays the conversation until later. Licenses, insurance, and documentation matter. This part may not feel exciting, but it matters enormously. Owners should understand who is licensed, what type of license applies, whether insurance is current, whether workers' compensation coverage exists if required, who is actually supervising the project, and what documentation should be collected throughout the process, because construction involves liability. And many owners do not realize how exposed they can become when these areas are not clarified early. This is another reason structure matters before work begins. Low conflict projects usually have better clarity. Another thing I've noticed over the years is this: projects with strong clarity early usually experience less conflict later. Not because problems never happen, but because expectations were discussed earlier. Responsibilities were clearer, processes were documented, and communication systems already existed before pressure entered the project. Conflict often grows where assumptions exist. That is why contracts matter. They create structure around uncertainty. Understand termination and dispute language. This is the area many people completely skip reading. Termination clauses, dispute resolution, legal language. And honestly, nobody likes thinking about worst case scenarios, but understanding how disagreements would be handled matters. For example, what happens if the relationship breaks down? What happens if the project pauses? What happens if someone wants to terminate the agreement? How are disputes resolved? Mediation, arbitration, litigation? Again, this is not about expecting problems. It's about understanding the framework before pressure exists. Because once emotions rise during construction, people stop reading calmly. The contract should match the actual conversations. This is something to pay close attention to. Sometimes verbal conversations sound very different from the written contract. And when that happens, the written agreement usually controls the project. That is why important expectations should not live only in verbal conversations. They should appear clearly in writing. If something matters significantly, clarify whether it is actually reflected in the contract documents, because assumptions create instability. You do not need to pretend you understand everything. A lot of owners feel uncomfortable asking questions during contract review because they do not want to sound inexperienced. However, this is exactly the stage where you should ask questions. If something feels unclear, ask. If language feels vague, ask. If payment structure feels confusing, ask. If responsibilities feel clear, ask. Strong professionals should be able to explain the agreement clearly. And if explanations consistently feel evasive or rushed, pay attention to that, because construction becomes harder later, not easier. Contracts should create clarity, not fear. Now, I want to be careful here. The purpose of a contract is not to create fear. It is to create structure. Strong contracts protect everyone by clarifying expectations early. And the healthiest projects usually involve teams that communicate openly about responsibilities, risk, process, and expectations before construction starts. That transparency creates trust, not confusion. What good contract reviews feel like. A strong contract process usually feels calm and organized. That's the running theme here: calm and organized, not chaos. The owner understands the structure, the responsibilities feel clear, questions are answered directly, the scope feels aligned, the payment system makes sense, the process feels documented. Again, not every unknown disappears, but the project feels more stable because expectations are more visible before construction starts. Final thoughts. The one thing to take away from this chapter is that construction contracts are not just about price. They are about structure, expectations, risk, and communication. The clearer the agreement becomes before construction starts, the more stable the project usually feels later. Do not rush through the contract phase emotionally. Slow down. Understand the system you are stepping into, because contracts do not eliminate problems, but strong clarity helps projects navigate problems much more intelligently. Thank you for listening to Before You Build It. If you want additional contract review resources, planning tools, or guidance for your project, visit goeasyproject.com/beforeyoubuildit. And if you're preparing for an ADU, remodel, addition, rebuild, or major construction project, you can also schedule a complimentary project strategy session